Hey everybody, this is my opinion, and before we get this video started, I just wanted to thank any returning viewers for all the love you gave my previous video. It shattered my view record by uh, over 1,000. I especially want to thank this guy who left a comment letting me know that the S at the end of Illinois is silent. I'm still going to call it Illinois though. So in my last video, I discussed each state and where I predicted each of them, what president each of them would swing to come election day. And I tried to pay special attention to what I considered and what everybody considers to be the swing states: your Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and so on. But there were a couple of states that I felt were relatively assured for Joe Biden, those being New Hampshire, Minnesota, and maybe the most important state of this video, Virginia. And the reason I want to focus on these three states in particular are because everybody, voters, analysts, politicians, the presidential candidates themselves, are all so convinced that there's a looming chance of those states flipping Republican this election cycle. And after doing some research on these states and like their electoral history and kind of taking into account polls, national polls specifically, not really state polls, I've kind of come to the conclusion that there's there's a basis for thinking there's a possibility of states flipping here, but I would still conclude at the end that they're going to remain Democrat. Just some of them are going to be maybe the closest in their electoral history. So I want to start with New Hampshire because out of the three states that I still think are going to stay Democrat, this one would have the likeliest chance of flipping Republican this election cycle. If I had to pick one state that definitely flipped, it was going to be New Hampshire. So first, I'm just going to go over a couple of really quick electoral facts for the state. It was a historically Republican state, but the last time that a president won that state, a Republican president, was Bush back in 2000. The closest race ever since then was Hillary versus Trump, about 348,500 votes to Trump's 345,790 votes. And honestly, for every race ever since Bush in 2000, that is extremely close. That's like way too close for Democrat comfort. And the last little detail is that 2020, Biden expanded that vote gap again. I think it was like a 5 or 6 point lead. So the thing about New Hampshire is that out of all the New England states, most people consider it to be the most fiscally conservative of the New England states. I'd have to imagine that second and third most fiscally conservative states would be Vermont or Maine, really in no specific order. But New Hampshire's fiscal conservatism is definitely overshadowed by their social liberalism, and that's really why there has been a trend towards your Democrat candidates ever since 2000. But I also said that if I had to pick one of the three states that I'm discussing today, that New Hampshire would be the one most likely to swing Republican this election cycle if I had to choose. The reason I say that is because out of those three states from 2016, New Hampshire was so ridiculously close. And Biden's gap in 2020, he improved upon Hillary's numbers maybe by, again, I think it was a 5 point margin. There's a lot of room for improvement that a Republican candidate, even Trump, can accomplish and make that flip. I still think it's unlikely. I still think that the presence of social liberalism as the driving policy in New Hampshire keeps a Democrat keeps it a Democratic state. To the Republican credit, it does have a Republican governor, Chris Sununu. It does actually have a Republican-dominated legislature, but it's a combination of how the districts are set up, the moderate, probably liberal-leaning quality of the Republican candidates, and definitely the liberal leaning of Chris Sununu. I said it in my last video, but the only way you're going to succeed as a Republican running statewide or locally in a New England state nowadays is if you have a serious moderate to liberal slant on you. That's how Chris Sununu is a governor of New Hampshire. That's how Phil Scott is a governor of Vermont. That's how Susan Collins was elected to the U.S. Senate in Maine. Ultimately, I'm keeping it as a, I don't like to say these words typically, but tilt Democrat. I still think it's going to go Democrat, but I think it's going to be a tilt Democrat vote in the end. All right, so I'm going to move on to Virginia now. This is the one that everybody has been really putting underneath a microscope. People are so sure that out of all the 3 states, this is going to be the one that flips if any of them do. This is the one that politicians have been just zeroing in on this election cycle, especially recently. All right, so here we go. Virginia, historically Republican, but it then became a consistently Democrat voting state starting with Obama in 2008. The closest race in recent history was Obama versus Romney, actually, in 2012, and that was Obama's 1.9 million votes to Romney's 1.8 million votes. And then once we came into 2020, again, I don't remember if Trump kind of closed that gap a little bit with Clinton, but 2020, Biden expanded the gap again. If I had to take a guess, I would say that a lot of people probably think that there's a great chance of it flipping or putting it in the swing state zone because of the Republican statewide sweep in 2021. So Glenn Youngkin becoming governor, Attorney General flipping Republican, and I think was it Auditor General, Treasurer? There were a couple of other races that Republicans flipped. It was just a statewide sweep. I think we'd have to count that election as an anomaly, right? Kind of like Doug Jones beating that Republican in Alabama. I'm struggling with the Republican's name. I knew his name last video. But that election also, that was an anomaly just because of how terrible of a candidate his opponent really was. Roy Moore, that was his name. Doug Jones beat Roy Moore. And I think the same can generally be said about Virginia. But look, at the end of the day, Virginia is still electing its 2 Democrat senators in their statewide races. I don't see it flipping. Does it come close again? Sure. Is Biden really going to be able to do anything to keep it from being a close, lower single-digit race? Probably not. He's at his peak now, unless something even worse happens, like a second debate stumble. But it's just not there. The votes, the energy, the momentum is not there for it to flip Republican. I just believe that deep down in my gut, that it is not flipping this election cycle. I'm really struggling to find my words here. And finally, we have Minnesota. I wanted to save this one for last because after just talking about how I'm not convinced about the whole Virginia flipping thing, I'm about to drop a really, really hot take here. Even though I think Minnesota is going to stay Democrat again, I think it has a better chance of flipping than Virginia does. But before I talk about that, again, just a brief overview. Minnesota, historically Democratic for the longest time. The only exceptions being Eisenhower winning the state in 1952 and 56, and then Nixon, his vice president, winning the state in 1972. Otherwise, it's always been a Democrat. Reagan, in 88, he won pretty much every single state except Minnesota, Walter Mondale's home state. Let's see. The closest race in recent history was Hillary versus Trump 2016. It was Hillary's 1.36 million to Trump's 1.32 million. And then Biden, of course, 2020, expanded that lead again. Now, why do I think it has a better chance of flipping than Virginia? Even though I just don't think it's going to flip anyways. Well, the first thing is Trump's performance in 2016 was shocking. I know he lost it, but just like New Hampshire, it was way too close for Democrats to be comfortable with it. And Biden's expanding of the gap in 2020 wasn't so impressive that you could say the same thing is going to happen again, at least at that magnitude. Probably going to be single digits again. The other thing is, and this is just speculation and opinion based off the facts that I found, is among the 5.78 million population of Minnesota, Muslims make up about 2.4%. There's about 140,000 of them. Because of Biden's positioning on the Israel Hamas, or Israel Palestine, whatever you want to call it, conflict, a lot of the Muslim population of the United States, or definitely the ones honed in at Minnesota, vowed to turn their backs on Biden come this election cycle. Does that mean every single Muslim voter would turn their back on Biden? Probably not. And in fact, a lot of them would probably hold their nose anyways. But if half of them did, a 1.2% difference could mean a lot, especially if we would be coming into 2016 voter numbers again. Ultimately, you have to look at the electoral history of each of these states and the trends. Each of these states have some anomalies in them statewide, but also statewide they have their two federal U.S. senators. They have Democrat trends that have removed them from either once reliable Republican strongholds or relatively reliable Democrat strongholds to far Democrat strongholds. And of course, just as important a factor is, to them, Trump is just a very unpalatable candidate. The focus should be on a candidate's positions and proposed policies. That's what it should always come down to. But unfortunately, optics really matter. And between the unpalatableness of Trump and the serious, legitimate concerns people have with Biden, people are going to stick with the man who holds more of their preferred policies and doesn't act very unstatesmanlike. You can tell how confident I sound about this when I sound like I'm walking on eggshells. But really, when it all comes down to it, everybody's going to have their own opinions. Everybody's going to have their own evidence and their own cache of facts that I've certainly overlooked and left out, that will lead them to believe indifferently about these races. Maybe it will flip. Maybe it'll stay the exact same. Maybe it'll just take the hardest left turn you've ever seen and Biden wins everything by 10s and 20s. That I am even more confident about not happening than of it flipping Republican. But this is just my own opinion. This is what I see going on in the States. And I think I'm going to wrap it up there, guys. If you like this video, go ahead and leave a like. Maybe consider subscribing. Definitely, please leave me a comment. Give me your own opinions on what you think about these states and where they're headed. Or even leave me a comment bashing me on my take on the Minnesota voting problem. This has been my opinion, and I'll talk to you guys later.